midst. Amen. So this little snippet here I found on the internet essentially is the way many of the young people feel today. Basically, I feel that religion outgrew its usefulness when science became as accurate as it is today, as do many others my age. And so we're going to try to help that person. And we have our mission statement here for insight: exalt Jesus Christ, teach the Bible, equip the saints, and tell the world. So I have the question today: does science disprove God? And I believe the answer is emphatically no. But we disagree with Richard Dawkins. He thinks it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person's either ignorant, stupid, or insane. So we get to take our choice. And then we have Richard Hawkins, and the famous astrophysicist, and he believes that because there's such a law as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there's something rather than nothing. The universe didn't need God to begin. Well, he passed away. He was born the same year I was. He's now passed away, and he knows the truth. That isn't the truth. And professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. So, can scientists be wrong? I hear this: well, if creation is true, why don't all scientists believe it? Science agrees that evolution is true. Can the majority of scientists be wrong? Absolutely. This is an example of a physician, Dr. Szemmelweis, who was a Hungarian physician, and he was in the mid-1800s, and he was a doctor at a hospital, and he used to be taking care of the newborn babies and the mothers that have given birth. And what he was alarmed at was that there was so much more disease and death in the hospital when women gave birth rather than when midwives helped assist the birth. And so he studied that, and he figured out, well, the people that are doing the deliveries and dealing with the babies and the mothers go and do autopsies in the morning, and then they'll come and visit the mothers and the children. So they're passing the germs from the corpses. They weren't washing their hands. So he instructed the people to wash their hands, and he instructed to wash it in running water. It's in Leviticus. It's a way of cleansing. You have to wash yourself, not in still water, not in a basin, but in running water, so that the germs are washed away. And he should have been honored. He should have been thanked and praised, but he was actually run out of the hospital by the other doctors who were either lazy or didn't understand why washing your hands was so important, even though the data said yes. And so this is an image of him tending to some of the people. And he's now honored. He has a stamp and everything in his country. And then here's another one. If you disagreed with this, the supporters of this theory included Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Winston Churchill, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Louis Brandeis, the famous inventor Alexander Graham Bell, activist Margaret Sanger, botanist Luther Burbank, Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University, novelist H.G. Wells, playwright George Bernard Shaw. Money was given to the people by the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and Johns Hopkins all supported it. And it was passed into law in New York and California. So how could you be against something that is so widely believed in? Well, the theory is called eugenics. We talked about that a few weeks ago, and that has to do with trying to sterilize people that are considered undesirable. So yes, science can and has made mistakes. That's not to say all science is wrong. We live with electricity, we have projectors and cell phones, and we have all kinds of conveniences. When the electricity goes off, it's a pretty meager life you live till it goes back on. So, we appreciate science, but we don't appreciate it when it's trying to push an agenda. And I'm going to skip over this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm tried to compile the 7 strongest reasons why I think that the evolution is wrong, and why creation by our Almighty God, as described in Genesis 1:1, is absolutely the truth. So there's 7 things: information in the DNA, the complexity of the cell, fine-tuning of the physics that's in the universe, the fact that evolution has not produced any intermediate species. Those are the missing links. They're still missing. Radioactive dating using carbon-14 shows a young Earth and a young dinosaurs. Dinosaur soft tissue is found, and that proves that the dinosaurs lived less than 10,000 years ago. And living fossils. So people that find fossils of animals they thought were extinct, but they're still with us. So we're going to go through those. And we understand the DNA is essentially the code that makes all of the body parts in any plant or animal. So the DNA is the instruction set. This is the instruction set that tells each cell what to do and how to make that animal or plant. And so there is a new science called information science, information technology. And we wouldn't be in the world we live today if it wasn't for this. So the definition of information is, first you have a code. So the code could be an alphabet. It could be Chinese characters. It could be dots and dashes like you send Morse code. It could be ones and zeros like you have in a digital integrated circuit. And then those symbols are arranged into groups that are called words. And so you can arrange the alphabet to form dog, chair, ball. But that doesn't tell you enough. You have to somehow put those words together and have a meaning. So dog caught ball. So you're giving some information with those coded letters, the forming of words, and then the sentences. And then finally, it either gives information or gives instruction. So that's the complex definition of information boiled down to its simplest form. If we look at DNA information, we have the code. We know those are the letters A, C, T, and G. They're formed into 3-letter words called codons. And those 3-letter words represent one of 20 amino acids that life is based on. So the action, the cell uses those amino acids to form proteins that are essential for all of the functioning of the cell. And the purpose is life. So DNA meets all of the criteria that has been set for information. And we know that just natural causes can never create information. You might have a tornado, or you have a lightning storm, or you see a nebula that's blown up, or you have a waterfall that you're looking at, and it's got a pattern, but it doesn't convey any information. And even the beauty of a snowflake, if you isolate a snowflake, it has a beautiful pattern. It's based on the way water molecules form themselves when they freeze. But there's no information. There's beauty. Well, the information in the tornado might say run, but it's not broadcasting it. That you're getting that visual from the thunder and lightning and the wind. So my conclusion is living creatures contain DNA. DNA meets the definition of information. Therefore, DNA must come from an intelligent source and cannot be created by natural forces or chance. So if we could play video number 1, Pastor Craig. This is Stephen Myers. Dr. Stephen Myers has a PhD from Cambridge University.
If you look at an effect and you want to explain it using the historical scientific method by reference to a cause that is known to produce that effect, the effect in question. So when we're looking at the origin of life, many biologists, biochemists, origin of life researchers in particular say the central thing that we need to explain is the origin of the information that makes life tick, that makes it run. What runs the show in biology is information, much of it encoded digitally in the DNA molecule. We're also learning that there's other forms of information organized hierarchically in other parts of the genome and even beyond the genome. But it's very, I used to ask my students, if you want to give your computer a new functionality, a new function, what do you have to give it? And of course they knew. Code. You have to give it information. And the same thing is true in life. If you want to produce life in the first place, if you want to develop a new form of life from a pre-existing form of life, you have to provide information. And so the question is, where does that information come from? And origin of life researchers are, in particular, acutely aware of this problem. Since 1953, when Watson and Crick elucidated the structure of DNA and also showed in subsequent years that DNA functions like a digital code in a section of software or even a section of alphabetic text. Once they established that, then that raised a question. How did that feature of life arise? If you're going to explain the origin of life, you've got to explain its salient features. Its salient feature is arguably the presence of digital information in DNA. DNA encodes the proteins that do all the important jobs in the cell. So where did that information come from? Since the 1950s, origin of life biologists have realized the central thing they have to explain is the origin of information. Model after model has stumbled or even come to a grinding halt, has failed to explain precisely that feature of life. And so as I got into the topic of the origin of life, I realized that was really the central question. And as I was studying how scientists develop their theories to explain the origin of the first life, I realized that what was needed was a causal explanation for that feature of life. And I began to think more about this dictum that Darwin and Lyell had, that we should be explaining things by reference to presently known causes, presently acting causes, and I asked myself the question, what is the presently acting cause of digital code? What's the known cause of information generally? And what we know from uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning in the past, about the past, is that information always comes from an intelligent source. Digital information, for sure, we know it comes from programmers, but information generally always comes from an intelligent source. So by using Darwin's rule of reasoning, I concluded that the best explanation for the origin of the information necessary to build the first life is actually intelligence, what we now call intelligent design.
So I think that puts it pretty clearly. I mean, this stands on the level of one of the laws of thermodynamics, the first, second, and third law of thermodynamics, the law of gravity, that this is always true. So this is pure science. It's not conjecture. And then the second topic is the complexity of the cell. In Darwin's time, with the simple microscopes that he had in the 1850s, the only thing he could see is just the membrane of the cell. Maybe if it were a living single-cell creature, he could see the wiggling and movement, but he had no idea what was inside of it. And now, with all of the research that's gone on, they understand that each one of the 100 trillion cells in the human body, and cells in cats and dogs and flowers and trees and bees and ants, every cell has all of these features. It has a power generating capacity. It has factories for making proteins. There's commerce, where there's complex transportation of different chemicals and items from one part to another. There's actually sentries, armies of portions of the cell that will attack if it's being invaded. Biological armies are ready to attack invaders, and there's a centralized government that lives inside the nucleus if the cell has a nucleus, and we know the DNA is the code. So inside that nucleus is a control center. And they've likened it to the complexity of a city, so you'll hear that in the video. And I have to bring up this point of irreducible complexity. This came up from Dr. Behe. He came up with the idea that if you have a irreducible system, irreducibly complex system like a mousetrap, you have to have all of the features of the mousetrap for it to work. You need the base, you need the spring, you need the hammer, you need the catch, you need the holding bar, and you need some food to attract the pest you're trying to take care of. If you don't have all those items, then it doesn't function as a mousetrap. The same thing with the cell. If you don't have the mitochondria, if you don't have the ribosomes, if you don't have the DNA, if you don't have the Golgi apparatus, if you don't have the cytoplasm, if you don't have the cell membrane, if you don't have all of those things all at once working together, it doesn't work. So irreducible complexity describes the cell, and so it can't live unless all of those things are present. And it's just amazing when you study how complex the cell is. So we're going to go on to video number 2. We're jumping through here quickly.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, published it in 1859. He had an idea of the cell as being quite simple, correct?
Yeah, everybody did.
Okay. If he thought of the cell as being a Buick, what is the cell now in terms of its complexity by comparison?
A galaxy.
If Darwin thought a cell was, say, a mud hut, what do we now know that a cell is?
More complicated than a Saturn V.
So what is in a cell as far as we know now?
A world that Darwin never could have imagined.
I needed someone who could give me a glimpse into this world. So we went to molecular biologist Doug Axe.
Think of a cell as being a nanofactory, a factory where, on a very small scale, digital instructions are being used to make the components of the factory. Here we have the famous DNA double helix. You can see the 2 helical strands that are intertwined and wind around each other on the outside of the molecule. This is the material that stores all of our genetic information. In higher life forms, this will be the equivalent of something like a gigabyte of information stored in the molecules that form the individual chromosomes, all packed within the nucleus, which is a tiny fraction of the entire cell size. So what does DNA do? Well, the information in DNA ends up providing the information for sequencing the amino acids to make protein. So we have information in a one-dimensional form that provides the information for a three-dimensional form.
I'm finally just beginning to grasp the complexity of the cell. Are there systems within the cell that go well beyond Darwinian evolution? Some type of cellular technology that drives adaptation, replication, quality control, and repair? What if these new mechanisms have massive design implications? Well, I say, so be it.
The cell really is like nothing we've ever seen in the physical world. That's got to be firmly grasped. That's not something we can just say, oh, well, it's just a little bit more of the same old, same old. It's not the same old, same old.
We are finding is that there's information that's in the cell that cannot be accounted for in terms of these undirected material causes. So
It has to be.
And so there's some other, so there has to be an information source.
So one of the key questions faced by modern biology is, where do you get information from?
Well, Darwin assumed that the increase in information comes from natural selection. But natural selection reduces genetic information, and we know this from all the genetic population studies that we have.
And where does the new genetic information going to come from?
Well, that's the big question.
Okay, so back to this slide. So that's number 2. So we've got, one is the information in the cell, and then number 2 is the complexity. You saw all of those little micro machines, each doing something and with a purpose of building and repairing and defending the cell. Okay, so now we're going to go to the third item. The third item is really the fine-tuning of the universe. So when you went to school and you were studying science, you learned a lot of different formulas, and usually they each had a constant in it. Like, say, Einstein's formula for converting matter to energy, E equals mc squared. Well, c is the speed of light. So C0 is 2.9979245 blah, blah, for, all the way around the room a million times. Epsilon, this is the dielectric constant of a material. E is the electrical charge on an electron, the mass of the proton, the mass of the electron, the gravitational attraction, and Planck's constant. Those are all constants. They could be any number. It could be any number. It doesn't have to be, the speed of light doesn't have to be that number. It could be something else. It just turns out that when you measure it over and over and over, it always turns out to be that number. So the question is, how did all of those numbers get to be what they are? And video number 3 will answer that question.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting. Or, another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. what is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are three live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence suggests that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
So physics is also pointing strongly towards design and creation. Okay, so let's jump over to the next part, is fossils. That's one of the things that scientists or people always point to. Oh, the fossil record that shows that the Earth is old, and it was created. We had life created, and then it evolved into all of the different life forms we see here: dinosaurs and dragonflies and leaves and bees and fish. But is that true? When you look at nature, you see perfect examples of, say, invertebrates. Let's take a starfish, and they say that evolved into a fish. Well, have you ever seen a starfish with a tail, or have you ever seen a starfish with an eye or gills? No, you never see that. Or a fish is supposed to have evolved into a frog, went from an animal that lives in the water to one that can live in the water or on land. And you never see these fish with legs or the different breathing system, because the fish extracts its oxygen through its gills in the water, where the frog is breathing air. Or the frog going to a reptile, or the reptile going to a mammal, or the dinosaurs they claim went to be birds. You never find any of these transitional fossils. And so it's just, it isn't you see what they call stasis. You see that animals that are dogs, they stay dogs. Horses are horses. The cats are cats, and they don't change from one thing to another. And the Bible doesn't have the same description, just like we talked about dinosaurs are in the Bible. They're called behemoth and leviathan and dragons. Well, the Bible uses the word kind when it's description of how the animals were made. Well, the kind is basically like a family or a genus. So you can start with all kinds of plants and insects and fish and everything, and as you go down, finer and finer tuning, talking about whether the animal has a vertebrate, is it a mammal, does it eat meat, on and on. You get finer and finer designations to see what the animal is. But it's not the species or subspecies, it's at a higher level. So you can obviously make two different species of dogs, a boxer and a dachshund, and you can have a collie and a black Labrador retriever mate. And you can have a horse and a donkey. It's called a zonkey. Or you have a zebra, or I'm sorry, a horse and a donkey is a what is it? It's a mule. And if you have a zebra and a donkey, then you got a z-donk. Or so you can have animals of the same genus mate with offsprings, but you can't have a dog and a fish mate. And the other inexplicable thing is the Cambrian explosion. This Cambrian explosion is supposed to have happened 600 million years ago. And during that explosion of life, it isn't the slow, gradual transition as is depicted down in the bottom where there's millions of years and each one of these animals comes into being and then it dies away and a new animal comes and it dies away. No, all of the branches, every phyla of the animal world is observed in this Cambrian explosion. That's why they call it explosion of life. And it's inexplicable how the scientists can say there was no worldwide flood. This is a picture of Mount Everest at the summit, 29,028 feet. Less than 200 feet lower than the summit, they found these marine animal shells. How did the animal shells get at the top of the mountain? Did somebody carry a backpack full of animal shells up there to throw around? I don't think so. This is a crinoid fossil, one of those. It's an animal, but it's got these fingers that catch food in the water as it goes by, and they find those at the top. And these are the places where they found fossils. So those red areas are where they find a lot of burial grounds of fossils. If you put arrows, so I put the arrows to the burial grounds, and then if you overlay that with the map of the mountains, you see that most of the fossils are occurring in the mountains. In Canada, they have the Burgess Shale. That has a lot of the Cambrian explosion. You see in the Andes, there's fossils in the Andes. There's Atlas Mountains in Africa and the Himalayas. We just saw the Mount Everest. So these marine animals are at the tops of all of the mountains, the tall mountains. And here's a group of people that are looking at a whale carcass in the Sahara Desert, the largest desert in the world. And then here's a highway down at the bottom. These people that are excavating, they found a whale carcass in the Chilean desert, and that's even drier than the Sahara, if you can believe that. And there's whale carcasses. How did they get there? And then here's evolution. Not. On here at the top, there's a deer that has fangs. There's its skull. So the top left is a deer. So what is that animal of the right? Looks like the canine kind of a creature, but it's got deer legs. Is it a deer, a fox, a wolf? Actually, it's a dog. A South American dog. Look at the spindly long legs. And they don't say that that animal evolved into a deer. They don't say this deer evolved into a wolf. They have a completely different chain. And then down at the bottom, they call that the vampire fish. Look at the dentures on that fish. It looks like you could take it to the dentist and he'd know how to fill a cavity on that thing. So they use these likenesses of one animal being similar. They call it homology, and they try to convince you. And it really is God. If he has a design that he uses for one animal, maybe he uses it for some other animal because it's a good design. It serves its purpose. And so the bottom line is there's no observed transition. This microevolution means changing from one family, one kind of animal to the next. The rhinoceroses and the triceratops and the cats and the frogs and the birds and the man, those are all separate and they're distinct. They're not observed any transitions in the fossil record, and there's no observable mechanism to make it change because the DNA is different. That's why they can't mate and have a live offspring. This is radioactive dating. You can hear the Geiger counter going there. Not that kind of radioactive. Sorry, this is radioactive dating based on carbon-14. So if you have isotopes of these materials, and there's a lot of different materials. Carbon has an isotope, potassium has an isotope, argon has an isotope, uranium has an isotope. But the nice thing about carbon, its isotope, carbon-14, decays from carbon-14 into nitrogen over 5,000, it has a half-life of 5,730 years. So in 5,730 years, if you have a 10-gram sample of carbon-14, it will become 5 grams, half. And then in another 5,730 years, that 5 grams go to 2.5 grams. And so each time 5,730 years passes. So if you know how much carbon-14 you had, you measured, and you know how much you had in the beginning, then you can use that as a clock to measure how old things are. And these are special, carbon-14 is especially good because animals eat carbon. So you're radioactive. You and your wife are radioactive. So you get more radioactivity from your wife than probably most sources around. So eating carbon-14, which is generated in the atmosphere by neutrinos that come from the sun, we breathe it in, we eat it in our food, but when we die, we stop eating it. So then they can measure how much carbon-14 is in an organism and then say how much they think there was, how much is left over, so therefore how old the specimen is. And so I liken it to a birthday cake. So happy birthday, and then the first day everybody has a piece of the cake and half of it's left, and then the second day your husband sneaks in and he's had a big piece and your kids are eating it. There's a quarter, and then an eighth, and then a 16th, and then by the 5th day there's pretty much crumbs. And that's the way it is with the carbon-14. Is it's decaying away over a long period of time. You have to have multiple 5 times 5,730 years. If you wait a long enough time, you wait 1 million years, nothing should have carbon-14 in it. If it's over 1 million years old, it should have no carbon-14. But here are the samples. These are dinosaur samples. Hundreds and hundreds. Each one of those little blue dots is a carbon-14 measurement. And in the box down at the bottom, you see that the majority of the data is within 15,000 years, and there's no data points above 45,000 years. So why do we get 45,000 years instead of 6,000 as we believe? And that's because before the flood, that the atmosphere on Earth had a lot more carbon-14 in it. It had a lot of more carbon dioxide than it does now because the whole Earth was a greenhouse. They find palm trees in Antarctica. They find that's why there's oil up there. It's because there's vegetation in the North Sea where it's so cold. And so before the flood, there was high levels of carbon dioxide. The whole world was a green planet. And so things that are dated real old, like things that died in the flood, then they'll measure to be higher than 6,000 years. But if you adjust that for the carbon dioxide levels. Now we're at 0.03 to 0.04%. They think it might have been 10 times higher. It might have been almost up to 0.3%, 10 times higher. And so when you do the dating, if you start looking at samples, you look at dinosaurs claimed to be 60 to 150 million years old, it has carbon-14 in it. If you look at oil, between 60 million and 112 million years old, it has carbon-14 in it. You look at coal, that's supposed to be 290 to 360 million years old, it has carbon-14 in it, and the killer is diamond, which is the hardest substance on Earth. It's supposed to have been made 3.3 billion years ago when the Earth was cooling from its initial hot lava kind of state and compressing and having all this high temperature and high pressure. It has carbon-14 in it. So diamonds, they dig out of the mines in Africa, it all has carbon-14 in it. How can that be if the Earth is billions and billions of years old? And the secular scientists claim this to be true. Okay, sixth topic. This is dinosaurs. We've got to talk about dinosaurs and soft tissue. There's a lady named Mary Schweitzer. She used to be at Montana State University. Now she's a professor in North Carolina. She was doing cross-sections of some bones, and she cut it open and she dissolved the bone away, the mineral part away, and she found soft tissue. And this soft tissue that they found is elastic and stretchy. So let's see if we can, I think the next one is the video.
What happened next happened by mistake. Mary put some fragments of the bone in acid to dissolve away the outermost layer of mineral. But the acid worked too fast and all the mineral dissolved away. Being a fossil, there should have been nothing left. But there was. And it was elastic, like living tissue.
This is the piece.
No. She showed us video she took under the microscope.
That's really what happened?
Yes.
That's the dinosaur bone?
Without mineral now. That's what was left.
It looked like the soft tissue she would have expected to find if it had been modern bone. This was impossible. This bone was 68 million years old.
So you see this and you think, what?
I didn't want to tell anybody.
You'd be ridiculed,
yes.
Right?
And so I said to my technician, okay, do it again. I don't believe it.
And yet, in sample after sample, they were there. Things that looked suspiciously like flexible, transparent blood vessels. She finally mustered the courage to tell Jack.
She said she dissolved the bone away and there were blood vessels. And, I was like shocked. I mean,
how could that be?
How could that be? That's right.
The things Mary was finding inside dinosaur bones,
look at that,
blood vessels, and even what seemed to be intact cells, pose a radical challenge to the existing rules of science, that organic material can't possibly survive even 1 million years, let alone 68 million. Mary, Jack, and their team published their B-Rex findings in a series of papers in the journal Science and were promptly attacked. Critics said their samples might have been contaminated, or that the supposed blood vessels were actually something called biofilm, a type of slime. But as Mary showed us, she's been able to replicate her findings. These are pieces of an even older dinosaur, a well-preserved 80-million-year-old duckbill. When she dissolved it away in acid...
Let's put this under the scope here.
Well, look.
Is that a blood vessel?
This is a blood vessel.
You're kidding.
You see the branches right there? And look at all of them. And it's so consistent over and over and over again. We do this bone and it comes out and I get excited every time. I can't help it. 80 million years old.
Mary published her new results last year, and while some of her critics have been swayed, the controversy still rages, and the stakes are high. If blood vessels can survive 80 million years, what about DNA?
Or maybe it wasn't 80 million years. Okay, so we'll go back, and then this is our last of the 7 reasons, I believe, creation through the sciences. So they said it can't last 1 million years. My daughter works at Amgen, and she sent me some articles that I read, and if you have proteins in that, they can't even last 60,000 years, not a million years. So that was, yeah, it won't last a million, it won't last 60,000. And if you find mummies, which they know are approximately 4,000 years old, when the Egyptian dynasties, when the Egyptians were mummifying it, they find a mummy, it's hard as a rock. You have to cut it with a chisel if you want to take a sample of the mummy. So it's clear that they can't have soft tissue. And this isn't just Mary that's finding them, it's all over the world, Italy and Sweden and all over. Once she found it, people started cutting the bones apart and they kept finding the same thing she does. So it's not an isolated case. And we have the case of our friend Mark Armitage, Dr. Armitage, who was a professor at Northridge. He excavated and found a triceratops horn, and he brought it back to the lab, and he used his technology under the scanning microscope to look at osteocytes and other cells that were soft and pliable within the horn. And he was promptly fired for his finding. Didn't say anything about God or anything in his paper. He just published his paper, and they fired him, and he fought it, and he won the court case. So he won that. But I ask you a question. Why is there no reports of dinosaur soft tissue when you go down to the LA County Museum of Natural History, or you go to the Field Museum in Chicago, or you go to the New York Museum of Natural History down in New York City? You don't see that, do you? And here's our friend, the New York Times. You know, even before Donald Trump, we still had fake news. This is a depiction of how the whales lost its legs and returned to the sea. So we know whales are mammals, they're air-breathing animals, and so they conjecture is it started as some sort of a rough-looking land animal, then it became kind of like an alligator, and then it went through. And here's the supposed chain. I pulled this from the website of UC Berkeley. It's got Pachycetus, which is like a dog-like animal, then Ambulocetus, and it's like a reptile or something, and then there's Rhodocetus, and that has flippers and a whale's tail and everything. But they actually confronted the guy. This is Dr. Phil Gingrich, who is at the University of Michigan, and he was the one that found the skeletons. And when they cross-examined him in a video that they took of the next person that I'm going to show you, Dr. Werner, Carl Werner, he said he drew the flippers and he drew the tail on because he thought it was there. He didn't have any bone structure to show it. And so he's confronted with the discovery. He was the discoverer of both Ambulocetus and Rhodocetus, and he added that the fluke, and the web feet. The fluke is the bone that flips the tail, and the web feet to Rhodocetus, without any fossil evidence. And subsequently, these are all over London, Berkeley. All of these drawings have this whale evolution, which is fictitious. And then we have the last topic, which is living fossils. So we actually have things like, this is a coelacanth in the bottom. There's sharks, and there's things that look like trilobites and everything. And those animals are still with us. They didn't go away. And so they cut living fossils. So here's the last video. This is Dr. Carl Werner. He's the one that exposed Phil Gingrich at University of Michigan. And so he's going to talk to you about his experiment on living fossils.
Living fossils is just one of 4 simultaneous experiments that I carried out to test evolution. It was based on a simple prediction that if evolution was not true, and if animals did not change over time, I should be able to find modern appearing plants and modern appearing animals in the dinosaur rock layers. And this is in fact what I found. First, I found a fossil shrimp in a dinosaur rock layer that looked very similar to a modern appearing Gulf shrimp. Then I found a crayfish in a dinosaur layer that looked like a modern crayfish. Then a crab, then a prawn, then a lobster. Soon I realized I had found all of the major crustacean groups in the dinosaur rock layers. Then I turned my attention to the insects. First, I found a modern appearing dragonfly that was found in a dinosaur rock layer. Then a katydid, then a cockroach, then a cricket, and soon I had representatives of all of the major insect groups living today from the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Then I had representatives of all the shellfish groups, the echinoderm groups, etc. And soon I realized that I had representatives of all of the major invertebrate phyla living today. I had found these in the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Next, I turned my attention to the vertebrates, and here I ran into problems. Museums were, for the most part, not displaying the most important vertebrate fossils. They were kept out of the view of the public. So I turned to the literature and began interviewing scientists, asking if they had seen any modern appearing vertebrates with the dinosaurs. And lo and behold, they had. Dr. Clemens reported finding a modern appearing parrot in a dinosaur rock layer. Others reported finding ducks, loons, flamingos with dinosaurs. This was utterly amazing. And others reported finding shrew-like animals, squirrel-like animals, platypus-like mammals, and other mammals in the dinosaur rock layers. Now, I did not find any of the larger mammals in the dinosaur rock layers, but this could just as easily be explained by a misinterpretation of the geological layers, which I'll explain in the fourth video. Lastly, I turned my attention to the plants, and once again, I found representatives of all of the major plant divisions living today in the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Sequoias with dinosaurs, oak trees with dinosaurs, magnolias, dogwoods, etc. It was amazing. In summary, I predicted that if evolution was not true, I would find modern appearing plants and modern appearing animals in the dinosaur rock layers. And this is, in fact, what I found.
Okay. So he's an emergency room doctor, retired, and decided to devote his life to going around the world. He visited 7 countries and spent 2 years. He and his wife went around and did the investigation. So they're finding all of the modern animals, not the horses and the elephants, but the smaller animals. You know, he said a duck-billed platypus and a shrew and a squirrel. So he's finding mammals, and that in the same layer that they find the dinosaurs. So it sounds to me like that would be more like a flood that killed the animals and not them evolving over time and being buried in the ground. So I leave you with this dichotomy. This is being taught right now. You can go to Moorpark University, Sisaki over in Camarillo. You can go to UCLA, go to Berkeley, Stanford. And on the left, you've got Big Bang Bill. He's talking about astrophysics. Any day now, we're going to pick up a tiny coded signal, and then we'll know for certain that there's intelligence out there, because the coded information does not arise by chance. And then next door is the biology teacher says the precisely coded information in each cell would fill many books, but we know for certain that no intelligence created life. So I leave you with that. And this is my final slide. Why does the universe and everything in it look so designed? The periodic table. And that's because it is. Think biblical creation. Amen. Any questions? It went fast, but I had a lot to say. Next week, last one I think in this series, I'm going to show you all of the frauds, deceptions, and lies that have been promulgated. The New York Times headline is just one of hundreds. I'll give you a display of all of the lies. So if you have a person that's lying to you all the time and telling you untruths and that, are you going to trust them when they come up with another finding that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that evolution is true? I don't think so. So I'm going to go through some of the things that, the monkeys to man and all of that. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.